Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second day of the Madrid Public Forum. We're delighted to have you back for today's action-packed succession of conversations, and it's a great honor and a privilege to have Heather Connolly with us today. As you all know, she is the president of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, but more importantly, she's a dear friend. And it's also our pleasure to have such a distinguished collection of speakers at this session. Thank you very much. Heather, the floor is yours.
Charles, thank you so very much. It is wonderful to be part of this exciting day and to be part of such a distinguished panel. This morning, we're going to talk about NATO in an era of great power competition with some extraordinary voices to help us think through this new era. But I would be remiss if I did not say NATO is in such a stronger position today to face that era of great power competition because we are about to welcome 2 new members into our family. So ladies and gentlemen, let's just celebrate this historic moment in welcoming Sweden and Finland into NATO. Belgian Prime Minister De Croo and I were talking in the back, and we were saying, you know, we get so busy doing the work, we don't take that moment to say, we are here as part of history, and that is very exciting. So we are waiting for British Foreign Secretary Truss, who is in traffic and will be coming here, but we are going to start unpacking NATO in an era of great power competition. First, we're going to begin with Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo. I'm going to confess to you all, the Prime Minister and I have had a chance to have a conversation earlier this week at the Brussels Forum, so we are a little practiced in this conversation. But Prime Minister Albanese, watch out. You're going to be pulled in here. But Prime Minister, let me begin with you, because I think the challenge is not the great power competition. We understand that. I believe, and you can press me if you don't agree, I believe the challenge is our competing geopolitical demands. So I'm going to put this more clearly. What's more important? Is China the pacing challenge? That is the great power that we have to pay attention to. Or quite frankly, over the last 4 months, it has been clear that Russia is the challenge, that if we do not get this challenge correct, we cannot get the Indo-Pacific correct. So, Prime Minister De Croo, let me begin with you. How do you think about the greatest security challenges of our time? How do you balance the competing demands of Russia now, obviously for NATO and collective defense, but yet China and the looming challenges of the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, I think it would be a mistake to put Russia and China in the same basket. I think it's a very different situation. The Russian challenge is an immediate one, and it's a direct threat to our Western way of life. Because in the end, we have a war on the European continent, but it's much broader than just this war in Ukraine. There is an energy war as well, which is impacting the entirety of the world. There is a disinformation campaign and destabilization campaigns. There is Belarus abusing of refugee flows to try to destabilize Lithuania. So our way of life, the Western way of life, is under gigantic pressure. And the answer, I mean, what kind of an answer have we given as a European Union? I mean, countries are lining up to join the European Union, so it's clear that as a European Union, besides soft power and hard power, we also have what I would call seductive power. I mean, we forgot how to seduce because of COVID, because we were afraid one of another. But we are.
That's soft power.
As a European Union, we are attractive. And look at what NATO has done. I mean, some thought, you know, NATO will be fragmented, will not be able to stick together. It's actually quite the opposite. And indeed, as you said at the start, what a historic moment with Finland and Sweden, countries who were not member of NATO for a specific reason, who understood that in the world of today, if you're alone in the world of today, it's not a good situation to be in. Countries who are alone today, or they're afraid, or they're on their way to join NATO. and we are extremely happy to be able to welcome them and to welcome them at this summit. From my perspective, this summit already is a success. I mean, we still have work to do, but that element, that message that you give to European population and to the rest of the world, especially to Russia, that message could not be clearer.
Strength and unity. Mr. Prime Minister, I want to just press you on thing. I do not know what the strategic concept will say. We are all eager to read it. But what press reports are suggesting, and NATO Secretary Stoltenberg has suggested that the document may say that China poses a challenge to NATO's interests, security, and values. But you would agree with that. Although you're not saying that China and Russia are equated, you would agree that China poses a challenge to NATO's interests, security, and values?
Well, look, from a European perspective, China is a partner. In some domains, we're partners. In fighting climate change, we are a partner. In fighting the pandemic, we were a partner. B, China is a competitor. On the economic side, it's a fierce competitor, but competition pushes us to be on the top of our toes. And C, they're a rival. And that's quite clear that in a lot of domains they are a rival. But so it is a country that challenges us, obviously. I think it's good that in the new strategic concept that China is part of that analysis. But our relation with China is one on different dimensions. I also think that the response we have given to Russia on the aggression on Ukraine is a message related to other security threats that could happen in other places of the world related to China.
Okay, fantastic. It's a great segue to welcome Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese with us. First of all, congratulations on your election and welcome to your first NATO summit. This is very exciting as a partner. Someone who observes China very keenly, I would love your perspective on how you see this era of great power competition as a great partner of NATO, and really how you see this era of great power competition and the competing demands, particularly in China, for the Indo-Pacific and in Europe these days. How do you balance those as Prime Minister?
I think back in Australia there'd be some people saying, why is the Australian Prime Minister at a NATO conference in Madrid? And it's because one of the things that's really been brought home by recent global events, whether it be the pandemic was a reminder, various cyber issues a reminder, but also the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has had an impact on our power prices, it's had an impact on global supply chains. It's a reminder that the days of thinking that you can compartmentalise, oh, well, that's an Asia-Pacific issue, that's a European issue, are over, if ever that was real. And that's why we have a direct interest in what is going on in Ukraine, in the consequences of the brutal Russian invasion. That's why Australia is the largest non-NATO contributor to support sovereignty in Ukraine, with $285 million so far of defence support and $65 million of humanitarian support. It's because Australia understands very much that what is playing out there has consequences in our own region. If an authoritarian state can attack a sovereign national state and seek to enforce its will through brutal military power, then that has implications for the entire region. Now, Australia is in the part of the world that's subject of strategic competition with the rise of China, the US's historic role, but also the important role that various European powers have played as well, France, Spain, the UK, in our region. And that's why what is happening in Ukraine has to be viewed in that context, and why in terms of a global order and the norms of international engagement are being tested here. And the resolve of the world is being tested as well. Does the world say, well, this has been going on for a while, so we'll begin to withdraw our support for the struggle that's going on now on the ground in Ukraine? Or do we say, no, that is something that we have to step up for? And I think it's very much the latter. And it is being watched in our region, where we have China, who we want peaceful and stable relations with, but the truth is that China has been more forward-leaning into the region. We've seen an agreement between the Solomons and China in our region that is potentially of some concern. And my government in the last month has very much reached out to make sure that we continue to remind, for example, our Pacific Island neighbours that our support comes without strings attached. We're good neighbours. We are historically the security partner of choice in the Pacific, along with our friends. But it is something that we can't take for granted. So whereas I think historically it's fair to say that most Australians wouldn't have thought greatly about Ukraine, they are thinking now. And there's bipartisan support for the commitments that have been made. President Zelensky addressed our parliament on the last sitting day, on the day of my budget reply as opposition leader. And there is support for us to continue to engage. And across the political spectrum, there's certainly very broad support for my presence here at NATO. And I think that it has been, thank you to NATO and its leadership, Jens Stoltenberg in particular, for reaching out and making sure that the Asia-Pacific leaders, not just myself, but Japan, Korea and New Zealand, are here present as well, which just sends that message to the world as well as specifically to our region that it matters what happens here.
Strengthen numbers, strengthen unity. And I think it's equally interesting. The Indonesian president is visiting President Zelensky in Kyiv right now, so that Indo-Pacific element here with Ukraine. Mr. Prime Minister, let me ask you, because you gave an interview before traveling to Madrid, saying that you believe the Chinese government had some lessons to learn from Russia's strategic failure. And I was hoping I could pull that out a little bit, because what do you believe, following obviously politics, domestic internal issues in Beijing so closely, what do you think Beijing is internalizing with allied resolve and response to the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think that objectively, certainly in Australia, when you saw from one perspective, you have Russia, which has been historically a very powerful nation state, versus Ukraine, historically not as powerful. I think there was a perception that this would be over relatively quickly. There was also a perception that there might be some argument, not about substance, but about process and contribution. And what we've seen is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has produced a more united world in terms of democratic nations, and a resolve that is strong and clear, and I believe will be decisive as well. And that's a very positive message. That the attack on a sovereign nation won't be just regarded as being just about Ukraine. It is about the way that the UN Charter is implemented. It is about the international rule of law, and if it is allowed to be subjugated by brute force, then that does have implications for the region. And I'm absolutely certain that China, in terms of the context here, as Russian forces were being mobilised around borders while Olympic Games were going on. You had the Partnership Without Limits signed between China and Russia, and that was part of the process leading up to the Russian invasion, and that, I think, shows how interconnected
Absolutely.
China and Russia were. And in terms of the resolve, though, and the response, it I think, has been so strong. Yep. And the two new potential members of NATO just reinforces that, absolutely, I think, in the last 24 hours.
Indeed. Well, we are delighted to welcome British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss here with us. Perfect timing. No, you're perfect. And in fact, this is a perfect segue into the question that I was going to ask you as well, Foreign Secretary, because right before coming here, you also gave an interview about the lessons that you believe allies are learning, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, Taiwan, how they're watching this. And I'd love to pull that thought out, if you don't mind. What do you believe Taiwan, what do you believe the Chinese government is learning from allied unity and resolve over Ukraine today?
Well, thank you.
Oops, I think your microphone is, are we working?
Is the microphone working?
Don't think so. If not, that's right. There's a backup plan. That's a good backup plan. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, it's absolutely imperative that we secure Russia's defeat in Ukraine. And it's imperative for the sake of European security, freedom, and democracy. And it's the only way that we are going to achieve a lasting peace in Europe. There are some who are saying that there could be some possibility of negotiations now, whilst Russia is still in Ukraine. But I think that would bring a false peace, and it would lead to further aggression in the future. And we have to learn the lessons of the past, the failures of the Minsk Protocol, for example, in being able to secure a lasting peace in the area. So my very strong message is we have to defeat Russia first and negotiate later. And I completely agree with the Australian Prime Minister that we need to think very carefully about the messages we're sending to President Xi. We've seen increased collaboration between Russia and China, and we know that China is watching Ukraine closely. They're expanding their military capability, and they're extending their global influence. And one significant thing today is that we will see in the new strategic concept put out by NATO specific reference to China, because it isn't just an issue for the Indo-Pacific region, it's also an issue for Euro-Atlantic security. And I do think that with China extending its influence through economic coercion and building a capable military, there is a real risk that they draw the wrong idea, which results in a catastrophic miscalculation, such as invading Taiwan. And that is exactly what we saw in the case of Ukraine, a strategic miscalculation by Putin. So this is why it's so important that the free world work together to help ensure that Taiwan is able to defend itself and to stress the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan states. And what we're doing is making sure that Taiwan has meaningful participation in international organizations, but also working to strengthen our economic ties with Taiwan, because this isn't just about hard security, it's also about economic security. I think the lesson we've learnt also from the Ukraine crisis is the increased dependency of Europe on Russian oil and gas contributed to a sense in which Russia felt enabled to invade Ukraine, because they knew it would be very difficult for Europe to respond. So we also need to learn that lesson, I believe, with China, of not becoming strategically dependent on China, and in fact making sure that we have strong alternatives. And not just that the free world has strong alternatives, that also allies such as the Pacific Islands that the Prime Minister was talking about, allies in Southeast Asia, allies in Africa and the Caribbean also have alternatives to China's economic investment. And people will have seen at the G7 the announcement of $600 billion worth of investment through the Global Partnership for Infrastructure Investment Programme. And I think that's a very important alternative to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. So I think there are huge lessons we can learn, and we need to learn them as soon as possible.
Foreign Secretary, before you arrived, we were challenging ourselves on how we balance the competing geopolitical demands, and this is sort of my who comes first. Is China the pacing challenge, and we need to stabilize the situation in Europe to focus on China? As you said, the game is right now. If we don't get this right in Ukraine, and Ukraine wins and prevails, the international system is a very different system for all of us to work at. And I know the Strategic Defense and Security Review had that balance of focusing on Europe, Russia, collective defense, but that tilt to the Indo-Pacific. Help me understand how the government is balancing these competing needs, which take enormous resources, military, economic, and of course, diplomatic investment.
Well, the answer is we have to do both.
Both.
They're indivisible. And anything that happens that affects Euro-Atlantic security has a negative knock-on effect on Indo-Pacific security and vice versa. That is why it's so important that we have partners like Australia, like South Korea, here at our NATO conference in Europe. And the way I see it as working, and this is very important in the Indo-Pacific region, is of course countries like Australia are much better versed in the region. This is their neighbourhood, Japan as well. So we also need to work through allies, through collaborations like AUKUS, through the Blue Pacific Partnership that we've just launched with the US, Australia, New Zealand and Japan. And I see it as a network of freedom-loving countries that work together, share expertise, share experience, do things like joint military training. We had the recent deployment of the Carrier Strike Group out in the Indo-Pacific. But we clearly all have specialist expertise in our own neighbourhood. So one of the things we've been doing in Ukraine is helping Australia deliver aid into Ukraine through UK routes. So I think we can very effectively work together, but that requires us all as allies is, first of all, to be more economically open. The UK is currently working to join the CPTPP, so we can trade more with the Asia-Pacific region. I would like to see our American colleagues do that as well.
I second that.
And our European colleagues. We also need to be following through on investment, because for too long, the pitch has been left clear to Russia or China to provide security support, to provide investment support, and we know that that is leading countries down the wrong path. So we need to be actively engaged, and we need to work with each other to do that.
Prime Minister Chakra, I want to bring you in because I know you want to jump in on that, but I want to give a question, and this is like the rapid fire response. So we are united. We see the challenges of both. The network is growing of like-mindeds, but we also see a greater alignment between China and Russia. The U.S. just sanctioned 5 Chinese companies for supporting Russia's military yesterday. How do you see, very quickly, this converging alignment? Is it substantial? Is it convenient? They get a vote here, and how does that work? But Prime Minister Chakra, you want to jump in perhaps on what the Foreign Secretary said, and then, but answer that quick question as well for all three, the Sino-Russian engagement.
First on that, I mean, I would not overemphasize the scale of that so-called alignment.
Okay.
I think there's as many topics on which they are completely misaligned as that the topics that they try to push forward where they are aligned. But I think we have to be extremely clear towards China is that any active support to the aggression of Russia in Ukraine will not go unanswered. I think we have to be extremely clear on that. But on that so-called alliance, I mean, the economic cloud of Russia, it's less than the Benelux. So it's less than Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And we are moderately small countries. So economically, and that compared to China, I mean, how can that be really a sustainable partnership? I mean, it's something like this compared to something gigantic. So it's completely unbalanced. And I think that also in economic and in strategic interest, at some point, it will be unbalanced. So when we see alignment happening, we should point it out, and it cannot go without a reaction. But in the longer run, I'm not so convinced of that. The other point I wanted to make is that, look, we say Ukraine has to win the war. And there's no doubt on that. Now the question is how? Because, I mean, this might be something that takes a lot of time. And there's different ways of ending a war. As you said, negotiating, but I mean, not in this situation. And to negotiate, it's hard to negotiate with a wall, because there's no one there to negotiate, and in any case, not in the current circumstances. Second way is with economic sanctions. Now, the economic sanctions, they take time. They hurt on the Russian side. They're hurting here as well. Sure. And the key point remains, you can do foreign policy and you can do geopolitics as long as your domestic population is still supporting it. And that, I think, is going to be our main challenge in the months to come, is to protect our population for the effects of what is happening. And that's will demand incredible effort from all of us and incredible coordination from all of us, which leaves us to the third element on how this war can be ended, is on the battlefield. And that means that supporting Ukraine with weapons delivery, and I think the three of us have done our part in that, but that is going to be the path, the only path that will lead to the outcome that we want. And it means that we will have to increase in a dramatic way the support to the Ukrainian, to our Ukrainian friends.
Absolutely. Mr. Prime Minister, very quickly on Sino-Russian alignment.
Well, China seeks to be the most powerful nation in the world. That's what we're seeing playing out here. That's not, you can have different perspectives on that as well, but China seeks through that as well to reach out in opportunistic ways, whether it be some common sense of a lack of values, as I would see it, that they have in common with Russia in terms of a lack of democratic values that they have, an authoritarian streak, and just as Russia seeks to recreate a sort of Russian or Soviet empire, the Chinese regime is seeking friends, whether it be Russia or in the region, through financial, through economic support to build up alliances and to undermine what has historically been the Western alliance in places like the Indo-Pacific. So it's got to be seen in that context as well, which is why Australia, along with our friends here in NATO, see that we need to reassert our values in return. Australia's currently subject of economic coercion from China, with sanctions of everything from coal to wine to barley to meat. And we assert with the change of government that our values don't change. Our capacity to trade off our values for short-term economic interest will not be done either. We assert that those sanctions, there's no basis for it and they should be removed. So we want good relations with our major trading partner has been China. But what that means as well is that the world, part of the response to China and Russia coming together has to be trade diversification in our case, has to be greater economic strength. That's one of the reasons why one of the discussions I've been having over the last couple of days here is the Australia-European trade agreement needs to be progressed. Like-minded countries need to engage with each other and support each other, because that's happening for the non-democratic world. The democratic world has to respond.
Absolutely. Foreign Secretary, I'd love your thoughts very quickly on the Sino-Russian alignment and how concerned you are about that, whether it's in international organizations like the Security Council or military exercises in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, it's certainly very worrying that China is now making statements about NATO, it's making statements about the sovereignty of the Falklands Islands, and really moving from the Indo-Pacific sphere to also challenge, and this is why it's so important NATO responds with our strategic concept that specifically references China. It's also very clear that Russia is the junior partner in this relationship, and I think that should give pause for thought to countries like India. And I do think there is an opportunity, as well as working more closely with our Australian friends, and we created a blueprint of a trade deal that now can be used with the European Union Prime Minister, and joining CPTPP. We are negotiating a trade deal with India. I know Australia has already done that as well. So I think there is an opportunity, when we see the alignment of these two authoritarian regimes, for democracies, for free nations to work more closely together. And I think more countries now see the imperative of doing that. And it's no longer good enough to look inward and to be protectionist or defensive. We need to reach outward and create that network of liberty of fellow like-minded countries. And if you look at the G7, which I think has been a real force in this conflict, the G7 has been the coordinating body for sanctions. People said it couldn't be done, but we've now delivered over 6 waves of sanctions on Russia. We represent 50% of GDP. And if you add friends like Australia and South Korea, it's even more than that. And we need to use that economic weight to challenge that coercive behaviour. So if one of our number is targeted with coercion, the entire free world and those economies can respond. And I think historically we haven't used that economic power. We've been equidistant, if you like, in terms of who we trade with, who we work with. And I think countries are becoming much more focused now on, is this trade with trust? Do we trust this partner? Are they going to use it to undermine us, or are they going to use it for the mutual benefit of both of our economies? So trade has got a lot more geopolitical, as well as the security relationships we're developing too.
Can I just make this point as well? What's playing out in Sri Lanka at the moment should cause pause for thought as well. We have an economic catastrophe playing out there. China using that to assert political influence. And it should be I agree with what the Foreign Secretary has said in terms of using our economic influence. China seeks to use its economic power in a very overt way. And when we've seen a withdrawal, strategic errors by Australia at one stage with a withdrawal of foreign aid or a reduction in the region, what we saw is a step in. Yeah. So we can't have any stepping back because the void will be filled, and it'll be filled with strings. And I think our approach towards development, I think that the G7 decision of just the past couple of days to provide an alternative I think that the G7 decision of just the past couple of days to provide an alternative